Okay, welcome to our Camano Wildlife Habitat program. This is our, well, we started doing them in January of 2003, so we've been doing them for 22 years. So welcome. This is our way to spread the word about backyard wildlife habitats, as well as in our community project, as well as different aspects of having a wildlife habitat and living with the wildlife. So there we go. So we're Camano. We're an island in harmony with nature, 1 yard at a time. So we're a community wildlife habitat because we have 1,079 people who have certified their properties as backyard wildlife habitats. So you can see that there's been quite a lot of change in Camano in as far as development. So we can't really do much with the regulations and what's allowed and what's not as far as zoning, but we can do things in our own yards. And so that's what the whole idea of a community wildlife habitat project is, that we get a lot of people that have certified their yards as wildlife habitats, and that way we're linking up the yards with our great parks and preserves on the island. And so Friends of Camano Island Parks is the sponsor of our project, and they maintain and work on the trails, educate people about nature as well, and also help with the acquisitions of wildlife habitat on Camano. And so this is going along with the Douglas Tallamy. He has a book called Nature's Best Hope, and he's talking about a homegrown national park. And that's exactly what a wildlife habitat is. It's turning our yards into wildlife habitats. And by a lot of us doing that, we're actually creating a bunch of backyard habitats that are a homegrown national park. So what you can do is landscape with wildlife in mind. So you can see I moved to the island in November of 1994, and so this is what it looked like in that when we first moved in. So we had a nice tall cedar tree and we had grass, and then in 2002 I got involved. I started the Backyard Wildlife Project on Camano, and the lower photo, you can see we've done the left side of our pathway and still hadn't filled in the right side. So in creating a wildlife habitat in my yard, we did it in pieces. And so now it is wildlife habitat on both sides, and you'll notice there's layers. So there's ground cover, there's shrubs, and there's trees. And so that is what a good landscape for wildlife has, because if you have grass and a tree, it's real sterile. Wildlife has their different little areas that they like you'll see the towhees bouncing around on the ground looking for bugs and seeds on the ground, and the kinglets like it up high. And so the birds have their different niches of where they like things, as well as the other wildlife. And so that's why we landscape with layers in mind. So to have a wildlife habitat, you need food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. And also, besides doing that, there's also a sustainable gardening aspect. And a big part of that is reducing lawns. And Paisley's going to get into that, how native plants help with wildlife. And growing natives is the natural thing to do. It's what the critters are used to, as well as it's good for water conservation, which is really important living on Camano because we are a single source aquifer. And if things aren't going into the ground, they're running off into Puget Sound. So everything we do matters in what it's doing to the environment. So that's why reducing or eliminating pesticide use and fertilizer use makes a difference in how clean things are. And that rather than, if you're taking some branches off or kind of cleaning things up a little bit, which we like messy yards actually, but if you have to do a little bit of cleaning, a brush pile is really nice. And that is good for your area 3 in your yard. So if you're thinking about wildlife habitat property, it's a good idea is to use Russell Link's idea, and he's a wildlife biologist with Fish and Wildlife in Washington State. And he wrote 2 books, Landscaping for Wildlife and Living with Wildlife. And in those 2 books, he talks about areas in our yards. So area 1 would be the area close to the house. So that's where you'd have your more ornamental plants mixed in with your native plants, and where you can have your bird feeders and your bird baths, where you can kind of watch and learn about nature. Area 2, it's a little bit more wild, and that's where you have your pathways. And then Area 3 would be like the back of the yard that might link up with someone else's backyard. And if both of your yards are are in the wildlife corridor aspect of, it's more rustic back there, then it's actually establishing corridors. So like we advocate for hedgerows for fencing types of things rather than fences, because the critters can get in and out. You maintain a little bit of a buffer, and that buffer, if you're thinking in the idea of layering, it's good for the wildlife. And in that Area 3, that's a good place to have a brush pile with some of your stuff that you've pruned. And then you can also go beyond habitat restoration and native plants in your own yard. You can do it as a community project as well. And that's what we've done in Camano with the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project, is thinking about working together and, kind of linking our yards. So on Camano, not only do we have the 1,079 wildlife habitats, but we also have 9 neighborhood habitats within our Backyard Wildlife Project. To certify as a wildlife habitat, it's real easy. It's just a little check off of how you're providing food, water, shelter, place to raise young, and practicing some sustainable gardening techniques. Note that it's a process. So you need 3 things to check off for food, and only 2 for places to raise young and shelter cover, and only 1 for water, because water is the most difficult. But it's a process in that, you don't have to be perfect. Like for the sustainable gardening, it's like some of those things that you can evolve into. For instance, once I started the project in 2002, I had 2 elderly kitties who could still go outside. I was lucky at that stage. They were mainly seeking sunbeams. Now I have 2 kitties that are nearly 19, and they have never seen the light of day outside, except for once or twice they've went out the door when it was kind of open for them and they didn't know what to do, so I could get them back in real quickly. So they're indoor cats. So I evolved from letting my cats outside to not. So it wasn't like I started right away. So when you certify as a wildlife habitat, it also makes you think about what you're doing in the yard, and how you can help. So now when I walk by my bird bath, I say, oh, I need to add some, especially in the summer. It's like, oh, it's getting low, I need to add some. Or in the winter, it needs more cleaning up because things have blown into it, or especially the fall. So the application you can find on our website. You can also go directly to the National Wildlife Federation. And what it does is it's kind of an opportunity to be part of a trend. There are now about 163 certified communities in the state, and Camano was the 10th in the nation, and there are 17 in the state, and we were the 2nd in the state. So with that, you can put up a sign, and what the sign does, it allows you to be a little messy in your yard. So wildlife habitats, they're not neat and tidy on purpose. So like my ocean spray, I love ocean spray. It's so beautiful in June. But, this time of year and after it dries up, some people think it's a little bit messy looking. However, I like to watch the chickadees going all over it, getting the little seeds that are left over on the branches. And so the signs and yard art are a good way to say, this is purposeful. I'm providing food, water, shelter, places to raise young for the wildlife. So you can see on the island we have quite a few dots, and with the idea that we're reestablishing some corridors, and there are more dots than on this map. I think this map there are about 700, and we're nearly at 1,100. So we have quite a few more dots to add, but you can see we're spread out throughout the island. So these are all the wildlife habitats in Washington. You can see it's a big Puget Sound area happening. So for the National Wildlife Federation, they kind of think of us as a kind of a regional wildlife habitat. beyond community, because so many communities are doing it. Because it really is an action step to go beyond just my yard. I can work with other people, and we all care about the wildlife. So if you're interested in even more about wildlife habitat and landscaping for wildlife, there's actually the Habitat Stewards training. We've done about 4 or 5 on the island over the years, and now we're kind of lucky that the National Wildlife Federation does these Zoom trainings about every other month. And so, or they did last year. This year, I'm not sure how often they'll have them, but it's a nice opportunity. They've actually based it off of how we presented them. And so you go to 4 sessions, and then there's some field opportunities. And then the idea is that you kind of go beyond your yard and help out in other yards as well. That's the ideal, but you can use it just for helping out in your own yard as well. So if you're interested, I think it's on our website, the information. You can take a screenshot, or Roxy might put it in the chat. I sent her some stuff, so I don't know if she's done it, but she could. Sorry, Roxy, for laying that on you. Anyway, so that training is really a good way to get a good foundation. Okay, and if you want more information about the National Wildlife Federation and wildlife habitats, there's the website. And if you want more information about our project on Camano, there's our website is wonderful. Roxy's done a terrific job. You can go there and find out about, you can go and look at different programs that we've done in the 22 years of programming. When Zoom came along with COVID, we started recording. So we have a library of different topics. So we do programs the 3rd Wednesday of the month. And so there's lots of different things available, like landscaping for on septic systems. That's a big hit. We've got one on landscaping for wildlife that I did in November. We've got one on otters, one on beavers, so various things. Wildlife, native plants, it kind of alternates. These are, I mentioned that these 2 books, Living with Wildlife and Landscaping for Wildlife by Russell Link. And they're fabulous books because they're about the Pacific Northwest. National Wildlife Federation does the book on the bottom. That is more general for the states. And with that, I just, before I introduce Paisley, I just want to tell you about our programs coming up. So in February, the 3rd Wednesday of February, I believe is February 19th, we will have, it'll be Zoom, and Ann Kramer, who's a wildlife photographer and a birder, and she's going to tell us about how to photograph in our own backyards, nature, and to do wildlife photography in our yards, and be ethical about doing that as well, and not being a nuisance to the birds, but being able to watch them and enjoy them and get good photos in a ethical way. In April, we will do, March, we will do, and it'll be March 19th, we will do one on rare plants in what's called rare plants. Oh gosh, it's rare care, and it's about rare native plants in the area. And so that is something new, a new spin on native plants. And then in April, I have to think of my months here. April, Joe Mesh will come, and he will give a presentation of birds and nests. So those are our programs coming up. And with that, I will stop my share, and I will introduce you to Paisley. So Paisley Blume is our speaker tonight, and she is the Habitat Restoration Project Assistant for the Snohomish Conservation District. She has a bachelor's in environmental science and resource management from the University of Washington. And while there, she worked at the UW-SCR Native Plant Nursery, and she did some research with Professor Effie and with the Pack Forest, and she was looking at variable density planting, and she could tell you more about that. And she also designed a study plan on the Olympic Peninsula to mitigate Scotch broom growth. And she worked for the Olympic National Resource Center as a field technician and a crew leader for a couple of seasons. And now she's at the Snohomish Conservation District, and she's going to tell us about wildlife and native plants. So thank you, Paisley.
Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Val, so much for that introduction. That was great. And it's definitely on, your introduction was very much on par with that, what I'm going to talk about today. I just want to make sure first that can everybody see my screen? Yes?
Looks
Okay.
fine, thank you.
Awesome. So yes, I'm Paisley Blume. I'm the Habitat Restoration Project Assistant serving Snohomish Conservation District, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today, virtually. And today I'm going to be presenting on how native plants can promote wildlife on Camano Island. So just a little bit about me. Val already gave me that lovely introduction. I did recently graduate from the University of Washington with a degree in environmental science and resource management. And during my time there, I worked with the Society of Ecological Restoration, which is also called SIR, at our native plant nursery and also doing some restoration work. This is definitely where I developed a really huge interest in native plants and restoration. In school, I was very focused on restoration and forestry as well. And this sort of love of plants really cemented as I gained more field experience, and I discovered that I really enjoy being outside and interacting with my environment brings me lots of joy. So I try to get outside whenever I can and stay active. I also really enjoy cooking and have rediscovered since graduating my love of reading for fun. So that's just a little bit about me. I hope to get to know about you a little bit, and I hope that everyone feels open to ask questions. We'll have some dedicated time at the end of my presentation as well. So some of my topics today are going to include talking about the role of conservation districts and a little bit of history about how conservation districts came to be. We're also going to talk a lot about some environmental challenges that we're facing and how native plants can really be a part of that solution. This will definitely lead into a conversation about the importance of pollinators and wildlife and also their respective habitat needs. And then throughout the presentation, I'll also be giving lots of native plant suggestions and tips for how to support backyard wildlife. And then at the end of the presentation, I have a whole bunch of resources. I believe Roxy's also posted them on the website, and there'll be an email going out to all participants if you're interested in looking into some of those resources a little bit more closely. So with that, I wanted to start off talking a little bit about the history of conservation districts. Across the United States, we have nearly 3,000 conservation districts that offer free help to residents to steward land, water, forests, wildlife, and other natural resources. Their mission really began after the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, and it really relied on working closely with farmers and rural landowners on a one-on-one basis. Um, Conservation districts really came out of a desire to conserve soil and water, and then furthermore to prevent wind erosion and also just a general need to take care of our land. The Snohomish Conservation District is one of 45 conservation districts based in Washington, and we are a political subdivision of the state government. And we work very closely with farmers, city residents, rural and suburban landowners on a voluntary basis. Some of our district boundaries include Camano Island, which was added in 1961, and then most of Snohomish County as well. I was talking about this with Val and Roxy that oftentimes I think people on Camano Island may forget that the Snohomish Conservation District also serves Camano Island. So please reach out if you have any sort of technical assistance requests. But we do operate with a very diverse range of staff, including engineers, resource planners, which is what I fall under, community conservation staff, field crew, outreach specialists, and also an administrative staff as well. So overall, especially specifically in Washington, more than half of our land is actually privately owned. So without a doubt, the success of conservation effort definitely depends on private landowner participation, which is why the work of conservation districts is so important. So a conservation district is not like I said, is non-regulatory. So we provide free and technical and financial assistance to land managers in Snohomish County and Camano Island. Technical assistant can take on a few different forms and is generally providing resources on any sort of natural resource concern. It can be conducting a site visit on landowner's property, and it can also be implementing a project, or it can be all of the above. On the habitat and floodplain team, which is the team that I serve, we are largely implementing habitat restoration projects. This can look like installing native plants in critical areas and within a riparian or working buffer. And we also work a lot on forestry planning. In general, flooding, erosion, and erosion from streams and rivers, things like beaver damage and weed infestations are all issues that many of us encounter on our properties. And we at the district want to give you the tools that you need to be good stewards of your land and your natural resources, as well as manage some of the challenges that can arise of living in such close contact with nature. So overall, we're really working with rural and urban residents to improve things like habitat, soil health, productivity, resilience, water quality, and we're doing all of these through using best management practices. We also have several other teams at the Conservation District and community, including our community conservation team and also our agricultural team as well, who work more in agricultural resilience and urban agriculture. And our community conservation team works more on doing things like low impact development that's sort of listed in that top bullet point there. So to dive more into the content for today, I want to start off giving you some foundational information. So I want to talk about why even use native plants, why talk about them. So native plants are those that occur naturally in a region in which they've evolved, and their ecological basis is one that depends on things like pollinators, wildlife, and people. So we're definitely a part of that system when it comes to native plants. And as native plants have evolved alongside local wildlife and pollinators, they've created a really finely tuned relationship with plants that provide things like specific food and shelter needs that support wildlife in their regions at the right time. And this supporting of sort of biodiversity and overall ecosystem health is really important. In the next few slides, we're going to get more into this idea of timing and why that's so critical when we're talking about native plants. Sort of in that same vein, native plants are also very adapted to our local climates and soils. For example, here in Western Washington, our climates are really categorized by our mild, sort of cool, wet winters and then warmer, dry summers. And this means that our native plants are really best adapted to those conditions. If you take in contrast somewhere like the Southwest US, their climate is more hot and dry and arid with warmer year-round temperatures. And specifically, they also have low rainfall. So some of our native species that are adapted to our local, more mild climate would likely not be able to withstand the conditions that of sort of a Southwest climate, for example. Climates and soils really do play a huge role on plants, even within a certain species as well. There most species are going to be locally adapted to their specific seed zones, which it has evolved. A great example of this is actually the Douglas fir. So Douglas fir is found throughout North America. However, a Douglas fir that is evolved somewhere in the Southwest, like Colorado, would likely not be able to withstand something like our Washington climate. So that might be much colder in the winters, due to just sort of the genetic diversity and evolving in such different climates, even though they're the same species. Another thing about native plants is that they generally will require less fertilizer, less pesticides, and less water once they're established compared to ornamental and non-native species. And native plants also tend to have a greater density of roots, specifically fine roots, which really creates excellent resources for habitat for our microorganisms that can really improve things like soil health and also stabilize soil, which can mitigate against issues like erosion, which many people who are living on Camano Island, maybe near bluffs, or if you're living near streams, might struggle with issues such as erosion. So when we're thinking about installing native plants, there's some things that are really important to think about, specifically environmental factors that are going to influence establishment and survival of the plants. Sort of taking the bird's eye view of understanding this is going to be more thinking about your climatic zone and specifically the amount of precipitation and your temperature conditions for whatever region that you're living in. But more specifically, I would really encourage you to take the time to determine site-specific conditions, including your soil type. So trying to determine whether or not your soil is more of a clay, more of a silt, more sand, or more of a loam. These are also taking into consideration your sunlight and water availability. And this also may vary on your property depending on topography and existing vegetation. So these availabilities of resources can vary even within a small area. And then these understanding sort of the variation on your property can really help choose making choices in terms of species that will be able to tolerate each of these conditions, and that's really going to be a determining factor in their survival long term. So we talked a little bit before about timing. And so native plants really exhibit a diverse phenological patterns that are adapted to their local environment. And each species has a very specific timing for growth, flowering, seed dispersal, and dormancy. And that ties in to that idea that native plants have developed this really fine-tuned relationship with wildlife and pollinators. So native plants are synchronized with the region's rainfall and temperatures, which impact their phenological patterns. And then we've observed that flowering natives are really tightly coupled with things like our native pollinator cycles to avoid a mismatch of habitat structures that are often observed when we have flowering non-native or ornamental plants. So essentially, when plants are flowering, native plants are flowering at the same time that their associated pollinators are also active. I made this diagram, sort of an example timeline for you all to sort of put this into a little bit more context of when we're seeing native plants exhibit different phenological behaviors. So, for example, our Oregon grape and osoberry are two of the very first plants that you'll start to see blooming in the spring, and they're really supporting those early spring pollinators. To me, osoberry is one of the sort of indicators that winter is over and spring is here. Once I see sort of those buds popping, the leaves are unfurling, it's like a very big ecological indicator to me. And you'll see some of those early pollinators sort of buzzing around those plants looking for some resources. And then as we sort of move into summer, we'll see species like red flowering currant and Oregon iris starting to bloom. And those are supporting some of our summer pollinators. And then during the late summer, we'll often see that some of the early bloomers, such as twinberry or Oregon grape, are actually now producing some berries that can support some of our birds and other wildlife species. And then new flowering species such as lupin, pearly everlasting, or Canadian goldenrod will continue to bloom through summer and even into fall. So this is really showing how a diversity of native species can provide really incredible opportunities for resources throughout multiple seasons. And now that we've talked about sort of how pollinators are linked to native plants, I think it's also important to talk about why pollinators are even important in the first place. The primary role of pollinators is to support and plant reproduction. They really are the agents of transportation of pollen that allows reproduction of many plants and also will increase genetic diversity by moving pollen around across longer distances than a plant ever could. In terms of agriculture and our food systems, native pollinators play a huge role. A study in 2006 actually determined that 1/3 of our food is dependent on pollinators, and specifically that wild pollinators contribute nearly $3 billion in pollination services. I really want to include these figures as a way to represent some of the economic value that we're seeing in our food systems for pollinators. And if you're interested in reading more of this study, it'll be included in the list of resources that I made for you all. And then if we're thinking about more from the wildlife perspective, pollinators are actually supporting around 75% of flowering plants, which allows them to produce more berries and reproduce, creating new plants for habitat and also food resources. So really, pollinators are the linchpins in our ecosystem. Without them, we would see such a huge decrease in both food products, but also in habitat for wildlife. Something that's really exciting and a really easy feature that you might be able to add to your space is something we call a pollinator meadow. This is essentially an area where we have a variety of native and sometimes non-native flowering plants that are chosen specifically for their relationship with pollinators. They're attracting them. This is a really great way to promote some biodiversity in your gardens and also to support pollinators by providing pollen resources. If you're interested also in transitioning from maybe more height maintenance, grass dominant lawn, this is a really great alternative. Pollinator meadows are super low maintenance and they really don't require a lot of irrigation, fertilizer, or mowing. They are really self-sustaining systems and can also improve water infiltration, meaning water that's from the surface moving into the ground. And once they're established, they can be really drought resistant as well. Often these meadows are started from native seed packs, and I encourage you to check out Northwest Meadowscapes for more information on pollinator meadows. And also they have really excellent seed packets that you can buy if you're interested in creating a pollinator meadow, or if you're interested in planting some very specific species as well. We'll also be selling some of these seed packs at our plant sale in March, which I'll talk about a little bit more later as well. So as I mentioned that in pollinator meadows, sometimes we also will have non-native species that are included in some of these seed packs, because there are some beneficial non-native species. And I think it's important that when we're thinking about our green spaces in our yards, that we're thinking about how to balance natives and non-natives. I often hear sort of this 70-30 rule favoring native species, because it can be really challenging to fully transition to native species if you already have some established non-natives. So this may be a process that takes multiple years. I think Val in her introduction said it best, that it doesn't have to happen all at once. This can be a process. And one thing to consider while you're going through this change potentially is that certain highly hybridized plants tend to produce less pollen and nectar. And this means that it may be worth the time to determine which species are on your property and maybe prioritize removing more hybridized species and replacing those with native ones. That being said, there are also some beneficial non-natives. These species include some of our herb and vegetable species. For example, lavender, rosemary, basil, sage, calendula, and marigolds. That being said, there's also some non-natives that you should definitely avoid. One of them is called butterfly bush. Despite its name, it really does not support butterflies. It actually produces very little nectar, and nectar is what butterflies need in order to survive, so it's really not a great option for them. Another one to avoid is going to be common holly. Holly produces berries one of the few berries that's toxic to birds, and so they're unable to eat them, so it really isn't providing any sort of ecological benefit to them. Then in general, it's also really a good idea to avoid invasive species. For example, English ivy. I see this a lot on people's homes and also in their yards. And this can really inhibit photosynthesis, and it can even break branches off of trees, which could become hazardous to you and also to your property. Some other invasive species to look out for are things like knotweed, scotch broom, and blackberries. And if you ever are struggling with invasives on your property, I really encourage you to seek some help when dealing with those. In the resource list, I provided a whole bunch of people to contact and places to get some best management practices that are going to be up to date and scientifically backed, and are going to be some of the best resources for you when trying to deal with invasive species. And if you have more questions about them, I'm very happy to answer them as well at the end. So we're going to be shifting gears a little bit here, and I wanted to talk about a really important environmental challenge that we're currently struggling with, which is the loss of connectivity between wildlife habitat spaces. So as wildlife moves daily and seasonally in order to survive, often wildlife areas and wildlife themselves are becoming more isolated due to human infrastructure, such as roads, buildings, and also urbanization features. This really results in what we call habitat fragmentation, which is when part of a habitat is destroyed, leaving small isolated areas that are not connected to larger conserved areas for wildlife. Often this leads to a decrease in biodiversity and genetic diversity, which reduces populations and often can even lead to death, especially when we're thinking about things like road collisions. I attempted to find a pretty accurate statistic when it comes to road collisions and wildlife, but there's such huge ranges, especially across different types of species. But it's very fair to say that road collisions are super common, and they're a very big problem that impacts a lot of different wildlife species. And the way in which we use land in general really impacts wildlife as it alters their natural habitats, leaving these fragmented areas in degraded habitat. On the maps, sort of to the right, I pulled these off of Google Maps. If you're ever interested in seeing sort of what your area looked like historically, I really recommend it. It's very interesting to sort of see how use has changed throughout time. The map on the top is from 1984, and the map on the bottom is from 2020. And those orange circles are meant to just draw your eyes to areas where we can really see how some of those larger green areas have really been fragmented by urbanization. And we're no longer having those larger patches of undisturbed habitat for wildlife. A study that was actually conducted recently in June of 2024 by the U.S. Geological Survey and Oregon Cooperative of Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. They actually just led this effort, including universities and agencies, and then also tribal partners in this study to evaluate estuarine elevation change and also the resiliency to sea level rise in the Puget Sound. Because the Puget Sound in Washington is the second largest estuary in the United States, and it's also home to 16 of the largest river deltas, we can see how these rivers and these delta ecosystems really are providing numerous ecosystem benefits and services to society, including foraging and rearing habitat for culturally and economically valuable fish and wildlife species, including salmon. And in this survey, they concluded that since the 1800s, as much as 70 to 80% of the Puget Sound's historical delta and estuary habitats have been lost due to human development. And climate change and sea level rising are expected to further cause greater habitat loss. When I was sort of going over the study, I thought this was really a startling statistic when we think about how important the Puget Sound is, and it really highlights the need for conservation efforts to increase connectivity and also to restore critical habitat and wildlife species as well. So now sort of shifting to a more positive viewpoint, thinking about some more solutions, there really are a variety of ways that we can create connectivity in our landscape. On the larger scale, we have things like wildlife corridors that can act as transitions between large green spaces. An example of this here in Washington is the wildlife bridge over I-90. And things like wildlife bridges can help reduce the number of road collisions of larger wildlife and also just create better connectivity of these conserved areas. On the smaller scale, we have things like gardens, green spaces, and private property that can act as stepping stones for wildlife to move from one space to another. This diagram sort of in the center of the slide, I think really does a great job of showing how important the ecological network is. So things like stepping stone corridors, restored areas, and also the core conserved areas are all different ways that we can improve connectivity. And although this is a smaller scale, these step zones and these buffer zones are really, really incredibly critical to provide a mosaic of safe and suitable habitat for wildlife. And in this presentation, we're really going to be focused on how to create those step stones in our own green spaces and on our own properties. So in order to create these step zones, we need to first understand a few fundamental components about wildlife. Firstly, we need to understand what are the fundamental needs of wildlife. Those include food, water, cover, safety, and safety is also called a place to raise young as well. And we're going to go over each of these in detail, and we're also going to talk about the best ways to create them on your own property. Secondly, we're going to ask ourselves, who are we trying to attract? By answering this question, hopefully you'll be better able to make choices on which plants and features you'd like to incorporate into your own properties, because different types of wildlife will require different features. I really encourage you to carry these questions with you as we move throughout this presentation to get an idea of what plants and features you'd like to incorporate into your spaces that is both engaging to you and to wildlife. So here on Camano Island and in the Puget Sound region, we're so lucky to have such a huge diversity of wildlife, both terrestrial and aquatic, that all play roles in our ecosystem. Some of the ecosystem services that wildlife play include things like seed dispersal. A really cool example of this is birds that are eating berries. Not only are they dispersing seeds across a region, but often they're scarifying the seeds through their digestive processes. Scarification is just referring to sort of the process of removing some of the outer, sometimes even waxy layer of a seed. And that process allows for germination of those seeds. And for many native plant species, scarification is really an essential step in germination and wouldn't be possible without some of our native wildlife sort of assisting in through that digestive process. Some species will also eat less favorable species, other plant species, and also pests. An example of this is that some of our native bats and birds actually eat mosquitoes. Wildlife will also prune and modify woody stems and can improve habitat for other species. We're going to talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. Wildlife will also participate in nutrient cycling by moving nutrients through a system through their waste during migration cycles, by eating plants, and also when they die. I think one of the coolest examples of this, especially here in Washington, is the relationship between bears and salmon. As bears are hunting salmon in streams, often they'll take the salmon with them into the woods, and once they're finished eating, the parts that they want out of the salmon, they're leaving the carcass and the carrion in the woods. And that salmon is actually being then returned into the forest floor. Those nutrients are being cycled and allow for all of those nutrients to become available for other plant species. So I think that's just such a cool relationship between wildlife and our forests here in Washington. Wildlife will also create new habitat through their daily activities, which can create new habitat for other species. And I think one of the best examples of this is beavers. And before I continue on, I'd like to share this video with you all. It's from a wildlife camera on one of our project sites, and it's a video of a beaver and a heron as well. And I think it's really cool that we were able to capture two species on just one pretty small site as well. So there's a little arrow that's kind of pointing to where the beaver is swimming, and then the heron is just sort of here next to this snag. So I'm gonna momentarily just mute myself, and so we can all just enjoy this video for a moment.
Paisley, we didn't hear the sounds that we were hearing before. I wonder if that's because you muted.
Oh, maybe it is. Well, thankfully there wasn't too much audio, just a
Yeah.
little bit of sort
Okay.
of bird singing in the background,
Yeah.
and a little you can hear the river sort of moving in as well. But
It's still
sorry about
very cool, but I just
yeah.
thought
I
we'd
hope that was cool for you all. Sorry
yeah,
about
that
the
was really
audio.
cool. Thanks.
Um, yeah, I just think this video is so cool that the heron and the beaver are both captured sort of at the same time, especially because beavers are nocturnal and this video is, clearly taken during the day. So pretty cool that we were able to capture that on one of our project sites. To talk a little bit more about beavers and sort of their ecological role, they really have earned the name ecosystem engineer because they're creating, modifying, and also maintaining habitat and ecosystems just through their daily activities. And this can have a super large impact on the biodiversity of an area by bringing wood into water, and then that wood is also providing food and shelter for insects. And then those insects can become food for other species, including salmon. Beavers are also storing and improving water conditions by increasing water storage on the surface of ponds as they create them, and they are also increasing ponds in size. This water will then filter down and be able to recharge groundwater. And in some places, this will actually increase water storage and helps keep streams running that might otherwise go dry in the summer. This habitat they're creating can be really beneficial for a variety of species. One really cool example, I think, is amphibians. Lots of amphibians are actually laying eggs sort of on pond edges. And as those ponds are increasing, and as also they're staying moist and moving throughout sort of the drier summer seasons, it's creating more habitat for breeding grounds for animals like amphibians. And as our climate changes in the Pacific Northwest, we'll also likely see more rain and less snow. And with these larger sudden high flow events, we'll find that beaver dams really are acting like speed bumps in our streams, in our systems, that help slow down water as it's moving through some of our areas. And slower water means less erosion, and in some cases, it can also mean less flooding and storms. Oftentimes, I think people associate beavers with flooding, and that can be damaging to property. However, there's a lot of research that also shows that beaver dams are actually really helpful in containing flooding from storm events and high flow events as well. In a recent study here in Western Washington, uh, there was a study that looked into water temperatures in relation to beaver ponds. And they found that water temperatures that were downstream of beaver ponds were actually 2.5 degrees Celsius or 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit lower than upstream. And that's because beaver ponds were actually recharging groundwater that was then resurfacing colder downstreams. And as air and water temperatures rise from climate change, fish and other wildlife can get too hot. And this is what we call thermal stress. This is a really big conversation when we're talking about salmon conservation. And so some of these downstream cooling effects from beaver ponds are really, really helpful in keeping that thermal stress low. Finally, beaver butt dams also can hold more water in stream systems than streams can alone. In this way, beaver wetlands can also become natural fire breaks. And as fire breaks are more likely to occur on both sides of the Cascades, fire control is becoming increasingly important, and beaver dam wetlands can really be a part of that solution. I'd also really love to highlight our Living with Beavers program here at Snohomish Conservation District. We really strive to create solutions for beavers and for landowners, and we really like to push the messaging that coexistence is possible with adaptive management. And so if you have any concerns related to beavers, please reach out to us. Likely it'll be myself or my coworker Ariana who are responding to your TAs and can really try to help you gain sort of this level of coexistence with beavers and have some of the benefits as well. Now that we've sort of set the stage, we've learned a little bit about some of what the wildlife needs are, we've learned about some of their needs, let's jump into some more practical information. This next section is going to be focused on native plant species that specifically support wildlife and pollinators as a food source. Some of these food sources include seeds, berries, pollen, sap, nectar, and insects. We include insects because certain insects will actually nest and feed on specific native plants, and then those wild pollinators and wildlife will come specifically seeking out those species where those insects are going to be. So we have many examples of that as well. And with that, I'm just going to sort of jump into talking about some plants. I'm going to be mostly referring to these plants by their common name, which is going to be to the left, and then to the right is the scientific name. That's the genus and the species. If you do want to look up any of these plants, I recommend looking up the scientific name, maybe alongside the common name, because there are times where common names are not the most accurate, but these are the more of the common names, if you will. So starting off with one of my favorite shrubs, this is the red flowering currant. This is a deciduous shrub, meaning it'll lose its leaves in the winter. Red flowering currant really enjoys being in the full sun, but can also tolerate partial shade and really thrives in a variety of soils from moist to dry. It produces small berries and also these really lovely pink flowers. They're really great for all birds, but hummingbirds specifically really are attracted to these shrubs. If you can sort of see in that zoomed in picture, the flowers are sort of elongated, and those sort of elongated flowers are kind of a good sign that hummingbirds are probably a big fan of that flower type. And they also will support pollinators such as bees. A couple of other shrubs that I wanted to highlight is salal and also our short or dull Oregon grape. Both of these are evergreens, meaning they're going to be keeping their leaves through the season. So if you're trying to maintain some greenery throughout the winter, these are great choices. Salal is an evergreen shrub that grows in the full sun or shade in dry to moist soils. So based off that, you can determine that it's a very versatile shrub. It can survive in most places. It does produce edible berries. These berries, to me, sort of taste like a mix between a grape and a blueberry, but sort of mealy. They're not my favorite, but if you have chickens on your property, they love salal berries, and it's a great way to use them up. The salal plant will also produce urn-shaped flowers that are generally white, but sometimes also a pale pink. And bees are a really big fan of these flowers. A really great pollen source. Salal also has really interesting mycorrhizal connections within the soil. They promote specific mycorrhizal species, and so that can have some really positive benefits for your soil health overall. And the dull or short Oregon grape, like I said, is another evergreen shrub. It grows more in moist, well-drained soils. It really doesn't tolerate dry. It can grow in both open and closed forests, and it can grow in sort of a low to mid elevation. The flowers bloom really in the early spring, and they produce fruit more in the late summer. I think these fruits are a little bit more tasty than salal, a little bit more grape-like and less mealy, in my opinion. And these are really great for attracting those early spring pollinators and birds as well. The yellow flowers are also just a really beautiful sort of pop of color in any sort of yard. Another reason that Oregon grape is such an awesome plant is because it's a great alternative to the common holly. This plant is going to be a lot more beneficial to things like birds, compared to the non-native holly. Moving into talking about a couple of tree options, the chokecherry, Prunus virginiana, and also crabapple or Malasphuca are two awesome trees that are very similar, sort of in growth form and also in sort of general look. These are awesome in plants specifically for birds. They produce a super rich food source. They're both deciduous trees that generally will produce the most fruit in full sun, but can also tolerate some shade. And they both can grow in sort of moist soils. However, the chokecherry is going to prefer something a little bit more well drained, whereas the crabapple is a little bit more amenable if you have some more of a wetland going on your property. It can really tolerate that as well. I'd like to also do a little spotlight on roses. I've listed here 3 of our native roses, the ball tip rose, the Nootka rose, and the cluster rose. They are all very similar in sort of their growth shape and also in the color of their flowers. You'll see a variation from pink to white, and they all grow in sort of just a general shrub formation. They're going to grow best in full to partial sun and generally prefer moister soils. They're not very tolerant of dry conditions, but the Rosa genus is pretty versatile, so they can tolerate some level of dryness in well-drained soils as well. They are thicket-forming plants, and so these are really great for birds, insects, and pollinators. These are great plants for things like hedgerows as well, which can act as great transition spaces for wildlife and pollinators. Their rose hips are also a really excellent food source. They're very high in vitamin C, so that makes them really great for things like birds. Next, I want to talk about some ground cover options. Our first one, the not so appreciated Oregon stonecrop. It's one that I feel like people forget about a lot. I think sedum is a really cool genus. They're very drought tolerant and a really interesting ground cover. They sort of have a succulent almost type texture to them, and they actually provide year-round habitat for things like insects. So they're really going to attract a lot of pollinators. Butterflies love them. So much better alternative to something like a butterfly bush. This really interesting ground cover might be a better option for you. We also have the blue-eyed grass. The blue-eyed grass is going to prefer full sun to partial sun and sort of moist to wet soils. This may be a great species if you're trying to transition away from a traditional lawn. It's going to produce these really lovely sort of purple to indigo colored flowers that are going to attract lots of pollinators. We also have kinnikinick. This is an evergreen. It's in the same family as salal. This is one of my favorite plants. It produces these red berries that are great for birds and also sort of white and also pink urn-shaped flowers. They are very, very tolerant of more dry soils. These might be great for areas where you get a lot of sun and you're not getting a lot of moisture. However, they can tolerate moisture as well. Some more herbaceous suggestions, some beautiful flowering plants include Pearly Everlasting. This is a very, very drought-tolerant herb that prefers full sun and dry soils. It has very long, slender, and very soft leaves, and then it gets these beautiful white umbels, which are those flowers on top. Pollinators like bees love them. I feel like in the summer, whenever I'm out in the fields, I'm always seeing bees sort of rubbing up around Pearly Everlasting. They're also a little bit more of a late summer bloomer, so that's a great way to provide some resources for them in the later summer. Big-leafed lupin is another wonderful plant. It's a great alternative to the non-native foxglove. They have a very similar flowering shape. Big-leaf lupin will survive best in full sun and moist to well-drained soils. It's a very low maintenance. It also has the reputation of being deer resistant. However, I think that deers will eat anything when they're hungry. So this might be something that, plant it in your garden and get back to me. But the research says that big leaf lupin is a pretty deer-resistant species, and they're great for bees and also hummingbirds. Pacific bleeding heart is a very iconic Pacific Northwest species. It's a shade-loving ground cover. Its flowers are really rich in nectar and serve pollinators, and also butterfly larvae will munch on the foliage. And it has this really unique sort of heart-shaped flower. And it's also going to provide some really excellent cover for amphibians. If you're lifting up, some of that foliage in a moister area, you'll likely find some amphibians sort of hanging out, lounging in the shade. I'd also like to put another highlight on a wonderful combination of flowering plants, the goldenrod and the asters. These are pollinator superstars. They truly are a beacon for bees. They receive more pollinator visits when they're actually planted together. And you can also get this really wonderful sort of color contrast of yellows and purples. The yellow being Canadian goldenrod and this purple being an aster. In the top right, you can also see there's a yellow flower with sort of a darker center, and that's going to be the black-eyed Susan, which is another type of aster. And these are really common species to find at nurseries and also seed packets. These are great ones to add to something like a pollinator meadow, and you'll definitely see lots of bee visits if you've got some goldenrod and asters in your garden. So we're going to switch gears a little bit to start talking about water. Water is one of the hardest things, I think, to bring into your green spaces, but even though it's such a vital resource for wildlife, it provides services like drinking, areas for breeding, bathing, and also just general habitat. But it really can be hard to incorporate. So I have just a few tips for you all. And one of those just includes creating sort of a bird bath sort of an area. If you are going to plan to do something like shown in these photos, I recommend using dishes that have shallow sides or creating shallow areas within the dish to create areas that insects and other species can get into, but they won't get stuck or drown within the water. A really easy way to create some of these shallow areas is just adding rocks, and that can create sort of pools and shallow areas. You also are going to want to consider using a rougher surfaced dish. This might be something like a terracotta pot that's sort of shown in that top picture with the birds. This is going to reduce the likelihood of wildlife or insects sort of getting stuck or sort of slipping around inside the dish. It's just going to provide a little traction for them to get in and out. If you can also add a circulator, this will likely reduce things like algae growth and mosquitoes. And this is really important if you plan to incorporate a larger water resource, such as a small pond. Sort of a little bit of a bonus, if you are adding a water feature like a pond, I really recommend looking into adding some native aquatic vegetation. This will also help with things like algae and pests such as mosquitoes. And something that I think is really important is also to consider the placement of where you're putting these water features in order to avoid conflicts with other wildlife and also with your pets, especially if you have indoor-outdoor pets. Oftentimes, I'll see people put bird baths sort of in the center of their garden because they want to be able to easily watch sort of wildlife, maybe bird visits. But that can really put those sort of species that are using that water resource sort of in harm's way. It makes them much more vulnerable to predators and potentially pets as well. So I really recommend keeping your water resources in areas that's near other vegetation so that they can easily escape. We'll talk about this a little more on the next slide, but also keeping it sort of in a shadier area will help reduce like evapotranspiration. So you'll have to fill up the water less frequently. So just thinking about placement when you're adding water features to your green space is very important. Thinking a little bit more about water conservation, some of the important goals to think about is reducing stormwater runoff, which is rain or snowmelt that flows over the ground or impermeable surfaces. Instead, we can also think about in the stormwater that there's going to be potentially some harmful pollutants as well. So that's one of the reasons it's really important to think about where our stormwater runoff is going. We can also think about increasing water infiltration, which is the process of moving water into the ground through soil and rock. Some tips that I have to sort of achieve some of these goals is replacing hard or impermeable surfaces when it's possible. Things like removing concrete walking areas and replacing them with smaller step zones and more native vegetation. This can also look like installing a rain barrel that will allow you to capture water from the roof and hold it for later use. For example, you might be able to use that water to, water all of your new amazing native plants while they're getting established. And on sort of that same note, installing native plants can be a super great way to sort of improve water infiltration. We can create sort of buffer areas around also bodies of water. Installing these riparian buffers, which is just planting native species along bodies of water to improve that water quality, is a huge part of what the habitat floodplain does here at Snohomish Conservation District. And these plantings are really excellent ways to filter water and also absorb excess nutrients while also creating really valuable habitat. Something else that you can do is install a rain or a bog garden. We're going to talk about this more on the next slide, so get excited for it. And then some tips I have for when you're storing water, especially on your property, is to keep it more in shady areas. And if you are planning on watering something like your plants or your lawn, to do that in the early mornings or in the evenings in order to reduce evapotranspiration, essentially the loss of water to the atmosphere when it's heated by the sun. And you also are going to want to avoid directing water towards slopes. We will talk more about this when I'm going to have a little bit of a discussion about slopes and bluffs, but in general, water is an eroding agent, so we want to avoid moving that towards sensitive areas that might cause future hazards, especially when we're talking about slopes and bluffs. And then finally, you're not going to want to plant any native species within 30 feet of a septic tank or a drainage field. The roots from these plants may disturb some of those systems, which could lead to some really costly repairs. So it's good to sort of leave that buffer area between some of these systems. So moving on to rain gardens, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Rain gardens are super cool. They're these shallow depressions in the ground that can collect and filter rainwater from roofs, driveways, and other hard surfaces using native plants. Here at the Conservation District, we implement rain gardens semi-frequently. Our community conservation team often leads this and other stormwater initiatives. Some of the great benefits of rain gardens include the ability to improve water quality, to recharge groundwater, to reduce flooding, and then also to generally improve wildlife habitat and also increase beneficial insects while reducing pests. And I wanted to talk a little bit about bog gardens as well. These are maybe a little bit less common. They may be more suitable when there is an area on your property that has consistently saturated soil, meaning there's permanent moisture. Species that are going to go into bog gardens are ones that really require that constant moisture. And we're going to talk a little bit about those species. So there's really a huge variety of plants that can go into both rain gardens and bog gardens. However, the ones that I selected here are ones that are also really known for promoting wildlife and pollinators. So these species are really going to satisfy both those categories of function, both being a rain garden / bog plant and also promoting wildlife and pollinators. On the left here, we have more rain garden species. That's going to include things like cascara, serviceberry, red osier dogwood, mock orange, Pacific ninebark, red flowering currant, the common rush, tussock sedge, and slough sedge. Serviceberry, red osier dogwood, mock orange, Pacific ninebark, and red flowering currant are all really wonderful shrubs that are great at promoting pollinators while also really being able to tolerate those wet conditions. The three bottom species are both sedges and rushes, which are types of grasses. They're all native. The common rush, I think, is a really excellent one. You'll see lots of grass species inside rain gardens. They're really, really common. They're great at filtering water. So I highlighted specifically the common rush and the slough sedge because I think those are two of the most common species that I see, grass species, I should say, that are planted in rain gardens. So I really want to point those ones out to you. And before we get into some species suggestions, I wanted to talk a little bit more about a bog because I think they're a very underappreciated natural area. I think they're so cool. And a bog is really just a specialized habitat that is generally formed when a wetland has an accumulation of peat, peat being a semi-decomposed plant material. And this setting creates sort of a low nutrient and sort of a slightly acidic condition. And these bog species are very resilient to almost anything except for drought. So really the main requirement for any of these plants is just that constant moisture, like I mentioned on the last page. Douglas spirea is a great plant. It also can be planted as a live stake, meaning it doesn't have to have roots necessarily when it's going in there. If you already have a Douglas spirea plant on your property, you could also harvest that, and that's a free plant right there to go right into a wetland area. It can also survive in and around streams, so like more of a riparian area as well. Bog cranberry, bog laurel, and bog bean, as you can imagine, all love to be in bogs. Really adapted to those wet environments, producing interesting berries, especially the cranberry and the bog bean, and also interesting flowers that can bring about some really cool pollinators. Bogs are also a really cool time to highlight some of our native carnivorous plants. If you're interested in more carnivorous plants, I highly recommend checking out the International Carnivorous Plant Society. Two that I wanted to highlight today is the trumpet pitcher and the sundews. To go back one slide, just to sort of highlight in this picture, the ones with the red top and sort of those green stalks are the trumpets. They're super cool. They're a great way to also reduce some maybe nuisance pests as well. And carnivorous plants are awesome. And if you have an area that has some of that constant moisture, I highly recommend putting some carnivorous plants in there. They'll be a great joy just to watch and observe. And yeah, they're awesome. Some other species that you're going to see in a bog for sure is going to be mosses. The sphagnum moss is going to be the main one. There's a variety of different species, sphagnum being the genus. And then, of course, that peat, which is going to be some semi-decomposed plant material. Oftentimes, this plant material was moss originally. So bogs and rain gardens, they're super cool. If you'd like to talk about them some more, please ask some questions. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have our very drought-tolerant species. I wanted to highlight some of these species that may be good choices to add to your property if you're really struggling to keep plants alive in sort of drier, sunnier conditions. And these conditions may be more common in future years, so definitely important to have a good idea of what some of these species might be to plant now if you sort of suspect in the future that your property might be becoming more dry and or sunny. I'd like to make a quick note before I just sort of get into talking about the species that drought tolerance really refers to once a plant is established. Oftentimes we are going to be planting more in the fall and into the winter when plants are more dormant. And they need that time to get established before a dry summer. So if you are planting when it's still warm out or when it's getting warm out in more of the spring or the summer, you may need to also irrigate those plants because they might not be able to withstand a dry summer yet. So it will take some time for them to get established. Sort of our first three species are our conifers, including Douglas fir, shore pine, and incense cedar. These are really just three great conifers that are super versatile and are going to be able to withstand any sort of dry soil. The next two species are chokecherry and garry oak. These are two great deciduous trees that are going to also be able to withstand some dryness. Chokecherry is also found in wetter soils as well, but it has that ability once established to tolerate drought conditions. Nine bark, red flowering currant are two of the most versatile and probably my favorite shrubs. They can really they're workhorses, especially in riparian projects. Wherever you put them, they're probably going to survive, and they're going to be great at promoting wildlife and pollinators as well. Sort of the picture in the top right with those beautiful white flowers is Pacific nine bark as well, if you're unfamiliar. Kinnikinnick, Oregon Sunshine are two more ground covers. Oregon Sunshine is this picture with the yellow flowers. These are going to be great ground covers that can really tolerate sandy and drier conditions. And then Romer's fescue is a type of grass. That's going to be this grass photo in the bottom right. Romer's fescue is probably one of the best plants that's going to be able to withstand dry conditions as well. So if you're interested in having some grass on your property, some native grass, Romer's fescue is a great option and is also going to be common in a lot of plant nurseries. Oh, there we go. So let's shift gears slightly to talk a little bit about slopes and bluffs, especially on Camano Island. This is a topic that we get a lot of questions about here at the district because slopes and bluffs can really be challenging to work on, and they're typically unstable and also sensitive areas. I highly recommend that you seek some guidance before planting or removing any vegetation on a slope, and do not remove vegetation without planting after, and really try to attempt to limit disturbance as much as possible. Um, by adding vegetation, this can be a really great way to stabilize slopes in certain conditions by reducing the amount of rainfall that's hitting those slopes, and also by stabilizing soils within root systems. Different types of plants, whether it's a ground cover, a shrub, or a tree, is going to have different rooting systems, and all of those can play a really important role in stabilizing slopes. I think this diagram here really demonstrates that well. Something you also want to think about in terms of bluffs is what is a typical bluff condition, and that is generally one that is full or partially in the sun. It's going to likely be dry, and it's likely going to be steep. So when you're choosing species that you want to plant on slopes and bluff areas, really try to find ones that are going to be tolerant of those sun and soil conditions. I would attempt to find ones that are going to be more deeply rooted, and then also ones that are going to limit disturbance when planting. We can talk about that a little bit more when we get into some plant suggestions. All of these species here that are listed can really tolerate those conditions that I mentioned on the previous slide. I split them into two lists. On the left, it's going to be plants that are more tolerant of full to partial sun, whereas on the right, it's going to be plants that are more able to tolerate shade conditions. However, I added that little symbol with sort of the cloud and the sun, and that just sort of indicates that these species, although maybe their preferred condition is whatever column they reside in, can also tolerate a variety of sunlight conditions. Species that are bolded on this slide are ones that can be planted as live stakes. A quick live stake definition essentially is just a cutting that is able from a parent plant that is able to root in the soil. So when it's planted, it doesn't have roots, and it's often just a stick. It's a really cool type of plant, in my opinion. We use them a lot on restoration sites because they're fast, they root really well, and then they're just great to provide some habitat very quickly for wildlife. In the category of sort of full to partial sun, our conifers are going to be Douglas fir and shore pine. Our willows, including Sitka, Pacific, and Hooker's willow, are three super great ones that are all going to also be able to be planted as live stakes. Pacific madrone is an evergreen hardwood, meaning it looks more like a deciduous tree. It's broad-leafed, but it's got evergreen leaves, so it's going to be keeping those through the winter. It also has really lovely red berries and has this delightful peeling bark. We're going to see a picture on the next slide. Twinberry and spirea are both shrubs that can be planted as live stakes. And Mark Orange is another great shrub that has some good rooting systems. And the kinnikinnick is one of those ground covers. I think we talked about kinnikinnick already, but really can tolerate those dry conditions. And it's going to be great for reducing sort of rainfall that might be hitting your slope. In sort of the partial to full shade side of things, we have beaked hazelnut, cascara, and vine maple, all as tree species that can really tolerate being on those sloped conditions. Oregon grape is one that we talked about. There's two varieties, the dull and the shiny, or the short and the tall. The scientific names being nervosa and aquifolium. Salal, evergreen, huckleberry are other really excellent evergreen shrubs that are going to provide really great stabilizing root structures on slopes and bluffs. And then finally, I wanted to add sword fern on there. Sword fern is one that we don't use a lot on restoration projects because we're really focused at SED to be adding woody shrubs and trees, but sword fern is a really great one because of its sort of growth pattern where the fronds sort of come out. It's a great way to also reduce the amount of rainfall that's hitting hitting slopes. So to take just a slightly closer look at some of these species, the top photo is the Pacific madrone. It's one of my favorite tree species. I think it's so interesting looking, and it's going to be a really great rooting tree that is going to really be able to withstand those slope and bluff conditions. I also wanted to highlight some of the species that have a tolerance to things like salt spray and wind, which are going to be really common on certain bluffs. For trees, we have the shore pine and cascara are going to be our two most tolerant species on this list of salt spray and wind. And then for shrubs, we have salal, evergreen huckleberry, the dull Oregon grape, and kinnikinick being some of those more tolerant species. Our final wildlife needs are cover and safety. Although they are very much related and often have overlapping features, cover is going to refer more to living spaces away from predators, and safety refers more to a space to raise young and for breeding. So this is going to depend from species to species. However, sometimes these spaces are going to be the same and sometimes they're separate. An example of this, I think, is birds. For example, birds cover maybe their nest, which will also be a place for raising their young, whereas an amphibian, for example, may be searching out cover in somewhere like a brush pile or some woody debris, but they may be looking for areas for breeding along pond edges. So sometimes these spaces can be different, sometimes they can be the same. It really depends on the species. Sorry, I just also want to talk about supplemental boxes before going to the next slide. I put quite a few pictures on here. We have a bat box, some roosting platforms, something that we call insect hotels, and then also a woody debris and a brush pile. These are all different forms of cover that different wildlife will use and can be really easily incorporated into your yard. These can really come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I feel like that's best demonstrated sort of by the quote unquote insect hotels. It could be something that's more elaborate. It can be something that's much more small. What you're really searching out is to create, for insect hotels at least, sort of hollow tubed areas where things like bees might want to nest in. And for bird boxes and also bat boxes and roosting platforms, these are things that you can either make yourself or you can also purchase them from people that are already making them at stores. So sort of choose your own adventure in terms of how much DIY you're wanting to do, but incorporating supplemental boxes into your green spaces can be a really cool way to interact with wildlife and sort of bring them into your space. Other areas of safety and cover that I want to talk about include bunch grasses. We already talked a little bit about fescue, but there's also tufted hairgrass. A lot of insect species really like bunch grasses to have that as an area of cover to get away from other predators. You'll also maybe find some birds hopping around bunch grasses looking for those insects that are trying to find cover. Something else that's really interesting that I think a lot of people don't know about is that bare ground and also sort of mud puddles are really important habitat features. 70% of our native bees actually are ground nesters. So sometimes having that bare ground on your property, even though you may not think it's the most beneficial, really is, especially for things like native bees. And same goes for sort of those mud puddles that might form during rain events. Those are actually really, really beneficial for butterflies that do this behavior we kind of call mud puddling, where they're sort of rolling around a little bit in these mud piles in order to get some really important salts and minerals from that mud. So even though you might not think it's important, it actually really is for certain habitat for pollinators. Another really important feature that you can bring to your yard for cover is going to be creating a layered canopy. Studies have been showing that plant communities show increased biodiversity and create really self-sustaining systems in which plants are really sharing resources. And we can see that they also have better water retention and also a decreased need for fertilizer and irrigation when they're planted together. And by adding some of this vertical and horizontal diversity, we're creating sort of a layered effect. Often wildlife will use each of these layers for sort of a different purpose. For example, certain bird species might be wanting to nest sort of higher up in the canopy in taller trees away from predators, but then will forage for berries sort of in that middle story area in the shrubs, and then maybe even will look for insects lower to the ground in sort of that woody debris or in that ground cover. So that's just an example of one way that wildlife is going to be using all of those different features in the layered canopy. Layered canopies can also bring around sort of a year-round interest for you as a property owner, and it can bring in sort of that interest by having a variety of different species and different heights and sizes and also different types, whether you have evergreens or deciduous trees or shrubs in your space can really add some variation throughout different seasons as well. Sort of on that idea of creating a layered canopy, I want to provide a list of some shade-tolerant species that might be excellent to plant in areas that you're wanting to increase shade and also promote cover for wildlife. Some of these species that we'll talk about a little bit really benefit from having vegetation features in the shaded areas as well. So some of the tree species that I've listed here are very shade tolerant and kind of will fill that overstory canopy area. Some of those species include western hemlock, western red cedar, and vine maple. Specifically, western hemlock is probably our most shade tolerant native conifer and will often actually come up after things like Douglas fir. When Douglas fir is dominant in the dominant in the overstory, we'll often see western hemlock coming up in sort of that middle story area, and then we'll eventually fill that overstory over time. Some shrub species, such as salal, ocean spray, and Oregon grape, are all shrubs that are also going to produce berries and flowers that attract wildlife and pollinators, while also being super shade tolerant. And then I think this is just a really great opportunity to also highlight some ferns. Our sword fern, deer fern, maidenhair fern are all ones that are easily found at nurseries and are going to be really great at thriving in the shade and also provide really excellent cover for amphibians and for insects as well. This is also a great time to mention one of my favorite understory and sort of ground cover species, which is wild ginger. It's got these super unique flowers. It's sort of this one in the left, sort of the bottom left. They're actually pollinated by ants specifically, which I think is really cool and unique. And it's got these really lovely leaves as well. And it's another opportunity to bring up Pacific bleeding heart. We talked about it a little bit earlier as a really excellent source of nectar. But again, it's really shade tolerant and it can also bring some really beautiful pop of color with those lovely pink flowers as well. So just some shade tolerant species suggestions for you all. I'd also like to talk about some snag and woody debris. This is a really, really critical component for wildlife that I think is often forgotten. This can come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. Snags are what we refer to as standing dead wood. This might be a dead tree. We also have things like brush piles and logs. This really is going to support things like amphibians, birds, and insects. We'll find that insects and amphibians are really looking for cover in those spaces, and then we'll often find that small mammals like things like squirrels and birds are going to be hunting those insects, for example, in those brush piles. And many birds, such as the pileated woodpecker and also several owl species, actually roost in standing dead trees as well, so that can create really valuable cover and safety areas as well. This photo of a wildlife tree in the top right is actually a photo I took down in Willamette, Oregon, in the Willamette National Forest. I think it's really cool that there's more recognition of just the general ecosystem service of having snags and dead wood in a forested area and is actually a feature of an old growth forest. And so by making more of an effort to leave snags after harvesting, we're seeing that it's having multiple benefits for a variety of species. So I think that's just really great. And I was so excited when I saw that wildlife tree in the forest. And woody debris is also just a really important part of nutrient cycling and is really great for your soil, alongside all of the other benefits that it's providing to wildlife. So as we begin to sort of reach the end of this presentation, I'd like to sort of circle back to a human-focused lens. And I really want you to sort of bring back that idea of how we're trying to make choices that are both engaging to you and wildlife when we're bringing native plants and also wildlife features into your green spaces. I think that humans, we really have a tendency to remove ourselves from nature and to think of ourselves as separate. But I really hope that this presentation can serve as a reminder that we really do receive immense benefits from interacting with wildlife and in green spaces and nature in general. In preparing for this presentation, I really did a lot of research on the concept of ecological well-being, which is sort of referred to as the relationship between people and ecological systems in our environment. This is becoming a really, really important area of study, and Western science is beginning to find some really fascinating results about the benefits that we're receiving by spending time in nature, which include, but are definitely not limited to, things like reduction in general stress and anxiety, improved mental cognition, a reduction of symptoms of fatigue, improved immune function, and an overall improved mental and physical health. And in many ways, Western science is now just catching up to the ideas that most indigenous knowledge systems have already understood for thousands of years, which is why I also want to share this really incredible resource for anyone who is interested in learning more about indigenous knowledge and also what we can learn from our environments and from plants. And this is the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She also has several other books that I really encourage you to read, but this one is a really great one to start with. The quote that I have here on the screen is from Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And as someone who works in the restoration field, I find this quote really stands out to me, as Kimmerer sort of is pointing out the impactful and enduring restoration requires more than just physical intervention, but it also requires reciprocity and a mutual relationship of benefit and respect between both humans and also our environment. To me, reciprocal restoration really challenges the notion of restoration as a one-sided act where humans are fixing ecosystems, but rather it's emphasizing a need for humans to also give back and to learn from and coexist with the natural world. So to sort of tie this back into our topic today, by promoting biodiversity through incorporating native plants in our green spaces and in our gardens, humans and wildlife also greatly benefit. Pollinators like bees and butterflies are supporting our agricultural and food systems, while healthy ecosystems are also providing cleaner air and water. Restored habitats are offering spaces for recreation and for education and for spiritual connection for all of us to also be able to partake in that as humans. In our native gardens, they act as these restored habitat areas for both in urban and suburban landscapes, and those can really help in mitigating the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation. And so I think by taking steps to understand the needs of wildlife, we can really create spaces that are both beneficial for nature and also for humans. So if you're interested in it, this is a great book. In the resource list, I linked her website, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's website, if you want to sort of peruse some of those resources. I'd like to leave off with one of the greatest resources, which is our Snohomish Conservation District annual plant sale. Our website is theplantsale.org. It's an amazing domain, very simple, right to the point. But you can also scan this QR code on the screen. Our online pre-orders opened up January 6th, and we already do have some species sold out. So if you're interested in purchasing plants, I would get on that sooner rather than later. Our online sales close on February 7th. And after that, you'll have to only be able to rely on our walk-up sales, but it's very exciting. We do have our walk-up sales March 1st and March 2nd. On March 1st, our walk-up sales will be open from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. On the 2nd of March, they'll be open from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Our plant sale pickups and walk-up sales are going to be located at the Evergreen State Fairgrounds near Monroe. Currently this year, we're offering 73 species, including 9 new species, and we have a minimum purchase of $25. The majority of our plants are going to be in bare root form, so they're not going to be in pots. They're going to be bundled up. We also are offering a few live stakes and plugs as well. This is also our 40th year of the annual plant sale, so it's a very special one, and we are going to have an excellent merch and informational table if you're interested in learning more just about native plants, about what the Snohomish Conservation District does, and other ways that you might want to, get involved if you're interested in restoration or just backyard habitat or native plants. Some more resources. This is just more of a condensed list. There's an email with more resources that are on your way, and they're also going to be listed on the website. In terms of native plant resources specifically, I encourage you to check out Washington Plant Society, the National Wildlife Federation. OSU Extension has really great resources, one of which is titled Shrubs and Trees for Bees. Conservation districts like SCD and also county have amazing plant guides, and I've linked a few here for some very specific plant needs that we kind of talked about today. If you're really looking to get some help with invasives, I really encourage you to reach out to any of your local counties. Also, specifically for Camano Island and for anyone in Snohomish, please reach out to the Snohomish Conservation District. And the Washington Noxious Weed Control Board is going to be one of the best resources for anybody living in Washington if you're wanting to learn about some best management practices to deal with invasives. I also have some resources on wildlife and pollinators. Department of Fish and Wildlife is an amazing place to start. If you're interested in beavers, go ahead and click this link. If you're interested in salmon, click the next link. If you want to learn more about some pollinators, the Xerces Society is a great place to start. This link is going to take you to their pollinator conservation program. I also linked Heather Holmes' books on bees and pollinators. When I first started getting into learning more about our native pollinators, the guides and the books that she's created were just immensely beneficial to me. They're really easy to understand and to read. She's got some great guides, so I really recommend checking Heather Holmes out. If you're interested in more water and garden design tips, I've linked some resources for rain gardens, gardening tips, general soil, understanding your soil better. And then also King County has these really interesting landscape guides where you can select different guides based off your very specific site conditions. For example, if you have dry sunny or dry shady, wet sunny, and all those different variations, there's a guide made for each of those. So you can get some ideas for both design and also plant species tips. Some additional information are just some of the studies that I talked about today. The first one being that habitat survey that talked about sort of the loss of Puget Sound estuarine habitat. I also linked the economic services pollinator study. And then I also linked a couple of documentaries that I thought were really interested. And if you're interested in learning more about wildlife and sort of some of the challenges that they're facing, these are two really great short, like under 30-minute documentaries to take a look at. They're free to watch. The salmon forest documentary is actually focused on the Tongass National Forest, which is in Alaska, but they really have a lot of topics that we're also talking about here in Washington. So it's definitely worth a good listen. And with that, I just want to thank all of the funders and organizers of today's event. And also just to say thank you to you all for showing up. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. I've also listed my email and my phone number if you'd like to reach out outside of sort of the presentation. Yeah, thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Paisley. So we've got time for a little bit of time for questions. And I think we've got already one in the chat. You're welcome to unmute and turn your videos on and ask questions in live. So can you see the chat, Paisley, or do you want?
I am. I'm just sort of navigating to it now.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you.
Takes a while.
The first one I'm seeing is from Steve. Any quick advice for grass lawn alternatives? Yeah, grass lawns can be definitely super tricky and can sometimes take a lot of time to transition away from that. I think just looking into some of those species, I've mentioned a few today that are really great to transition away from lawns. Some of our native grasses, such as, depending on sort of, your site conditions, we have some common rush, we have a variety of sedges, and we also have the blue-eyed iris. These are really great species to sort of transition away from traditional lawns. It can be really hard to get rid of those grasses. Shade is going to be a really great tool. If you're not opposed to things like tilling, you can also upturn that grass, and then plant over that as well. So yeah, hope that was a good answer. Any more questions?
What about, you said you have sale plants at the sale. Have you pulled out a few from every one of the species, or will they mainly be things that are left over? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have our walk-up sales and we have reserved some stock. So although there's some species that are sold out online, there's still an opportunity to purchase those in person at our walk-up sales as well.
So get there early.
Yes, definitely get there early. Saturday is definitely our busiest day, but it's worth going if you are really trying to get a specific species that has been sold out.
Cool.
Yeah.
we have other questions? I know it's getting late, but if we have other questions, we've got a little bit of time. Okay, well, thank you very much. That was fabulous. You've given us a lot to think about. Val, do you have any closing remarks?
Oh, just thank you, Paisley. You've done a lot of research and a lot of work to put this together. It was a great job.
Thank
There
you.
a lot of things like mentioning the bees needing the ground, and I like the, planting at different times, the flowers at the different parts of the season, and ecological well-being. You just brought up so many cool things that are important for wildlife and habitat and what we can plant for them. So thank you.
Yes,
Thank you,
it's
Val.
like
Thank
a
you.
whole habitat stewards class all in one evening.
Really
Thank
great.
you.
Nice
Yeah, I
job.
hope it
Oh, the
wasn't too
resource
overwhelming for
page.
everybody. And I'm so sorry that I went over time.
It was
It's just
great.
No,
It was
okay.
great. It was
it's
your
like
pictures were wonderful too. Did you
Oh,
take
thank you.
most of those or were they?
I took there was a few that myself and also some other planners that shared with me, which was really nice, and then some of them just from the internet as well. So a bit of a
They
mix.
fabulous.
Thank you.
All right. Any other burning questions? All righty. Well, then you can contact her offline. And thank you very much. And we hope to see you again.
Thank
Some
you.
of
Yeah,
these
thank you for
topics.
having me.
Okay.
thank you everyone. And
All
thank you,
right.
Have a good night.
Bye,
Paisley.
Thank
everybody.
you.